Hi, boys and girls. Today, let's talk about doing our patterns in complementary colors. In front of us here, I have a little breakdown of using just the primary and secondary colors on our color wheel. To make our complementary colors, we discussed that we need to use the colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. I have a little arrow showing that blue is across from orange. Up here, you can see how the blue really pops out against the orange, and so the orange against the blue. We also talked about a couple teams that use this specifically on Long Island. We've got the Islanders, the Knicks, and the Mets use blue and orange in their color scheme for the sports colors. I also have purple and yellow and green and red. Makes you think a lot like Christmas up here for this, doesn't it? So we are always using one cool color and one warm color when we're making our complementary colors. This is what makes the contrast when it really pops out to you, really stands out. But if we mix the two colors together on each of my color examples, you can see how it gets very muddy looking. It gets very brown. So we are going to use the paint resist method, and that's why we're going to use crayon specifically for our patterns, because when we go over in the complementary color, it won't be muddy like that. The blue would still show through if I did orange in my background. Let's take a look at how we're going to add crayon though first onto our patterns. Over here, I have a close-up of a little bit of a pattern that I did in another hand. You can see I did part of it, and I wanted to point something out to you guys. If you make your patterns really small, it gets really hard to copy them over in the crayon. If you have a tip, you're constantly trying to roll your crayon around to try to get a nice fine tip. If your crayon's really dull, then it's much harder. So instead of making these really tiny little fingers, I made some bigger fingers to show you. So if you do any really small little designs, keep in mind we're doing it in crayon, so it's going to be a little tough. I would suggest to try to make your designs a little bigger. We only need 3 different pattern designs. So you can use some that are a little bigger to fill up the page. If you look at my eyes, they're really nice and big, but they're still a pattern. They're repeating. Today, what we're going to need is a pencil if you need to finish up doing your patterns, definitely an eraser, and we're going to need our complementary color choice. Since I have red going on here, then green will be the background color for my watercolor. So what do I do first? First, I am going to make sure that you guys can see on the camera, so excuse me while I tilt my paper a little bit so it's in view. And you take your eraser and you lightly erase some of the lines. You may not want to erase everything at once because if you drew too lightly, you won't really be able to see the design that you did before. So I'm lightly doing this. If you drew really, really hard into the paper and started kind of carving into the paper, you might be fine. And again, this is the harder part, doing all these really tiny ones. So you take your crayon and you just trace over what you did. Simple as that. And I am going to speed this forward and let you guys see me fill up the rest of this little mess that I made for myself. As you can see, it's a little hard to get those details in because my designs are so small and my crayon's getting a little dull at the tip. I'm going to finish filling these up and then we'll move on to some of the bigger sizes. You'll see how much easier that is. Okay, so I have finished drawing in all my tiny fingers, and you guys just watched me do all that work, but look how kind of messy it looks. All that effort, and it looks a little messy. Let's look at our bigger fingers. Here, if I take my eraser, I can still see all my lines. Let me erase a little bit more. And watch how much easier it's going to be to fill these guys in. So much better. You guys can still see what they are. It doesn't really matter if your tip of your crayon isn't all that sharp. I'm going to speed through and finish filling in the rest of this. And then I'm going to show you about using a different color if you like, because you don't have to just use the same complementary color sets. You could use more, or you could even use the other part of the set in crayon. I'll show you a little more in a bit. Okay, boys and girls. So for the rest of this outside part, I think I want to use green. And once I use green crayon to finish this little dividing pattern I have going on and these diamonds, I'm going to use red watercolor then on the outside. Okay, you can see I've got my red crayon, which I'll use green watercolor, and then my green crayon, I'll use red watercolor. For here, I'm going to throw in some blue and do some orange watercolor in the background of this one. All right, here we go. Now I have the start of a second complementary color set. Here was my original complementary color set. You can also make this all just red if you want, and then do just green for the background for our gradient. Today, I'm just going to give you a quick sneak peek at what I'm talking about by using watercolor. We'll go over a bit more in the next lesson, but right now, let's just take a look and see what will happen when we add watercolor to our crayon. That color still pops out. Our red doesn't look muddy and brown. We could still see all of our red coming through. Instead of over here, if we were to use marker, that would have been all brown. But we still see our red. And this is why the color resist is so cool. Take a little bit more water and you could spread it across your page. We'll learn more about what exactly a gradient is. But for now, let's just see how this comes out. Okay, I have the start of making a watercolor gradient. What I want to do is just make this area darker and I want to have this area be lighter. Again, we'll talk about that more in next class to understand how we transition from doing a darker color green to a very light near white color green. So I have created my gradient. Now I'll show you by adding some red over here and some orange over here, and you can get an idea how you could break up the background of your patterns with crayon and watercolor. Oh, and if you ever accidentally go over an area you didn't mean to, just take your paper towel and just kind of pick that up. If you have to go back over, that's okay. Just be really careful not to oversaturate your paper. That means putting a lot of water on there that you end up ripping up your paper. And there we have it. We have a couple different gradients. We'll talk about painting and watercolor a little bit more, and we can talk about going over some of our areas to make a stronger color. So once your area is dried, you could go back, you could put down maybe a little more green over here so that way it comes out darker. But we don't want to overwork our paper. Otherwise, it will start tearing and ripping, and it won't be a good time then. So next lesson, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But thank you for coming with me today, and bye-bye.